Great. Okay. Thank you very much. We have a great crowd here tonight, and I'm absolutely delighted because we have a very special guest speaker here. Some of you might remember Eamon spoke to us there 5 years ago, hard to believe, during our second or third lockdown over Zoom about the research that his PhD research that he had only just begun at the time. And I'm delighted to tell you that Eamon passed his viva, and Dr. Eamon Healy will be speaking with us tonight. Yeah, a big, well done now. You know, that's a big achievement. Anyway, he's going to be speaking on power and persuasion, what administrative choices reveal about your Clare ancestors' famine experience. Now, Eamon is a professional genealogist and historian who works with Ancestry in Dublin. He previously presented, as I said, in 2021. His research has examined how administrative choices during Ireland's Great Famine shaped survival outcomes by comparing two poor law unions that received different government interventions, Gort Union and Ballyshannon Union. Eamon's research represents the first collective biography of crisis administrators during the famine and demonstrates that the Poor Law Commission had deliberate strategies for matching intervention types to local conditions. This talk gives Clare genealogists and historians a framework for understanding what they find in workhouse records and census returns. Learn how to connect individual family stories to broader patterns of crisis governance and discover how administrative decisions during the years 1847 to 1849 created conditions for the post-famine clearances that devastated Clare communities. So well done, and looking forward now to hearing this. Thank you, Eamon.
Thanks very much, Jane. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. And I tell you, it's definitely a very different experience than sitting in my bedroom from the last time I gave the last talk. So it's a genuine pleasure to be back here, and just on the bus on the way down from Dublin today, I'm just going to take a moment that's not necessarily directly relevant to the talk, just to kind of reflect on the impact that the Clare Roots Society themselves actually had on me. So I remember working in Shields out near the hospital. I'm sure most of you will know it. And I knew very quickly that retail wasn't for me as a career. And I didn't necessarily think that I could become a professional genealogist, but I dragged myself along to a Clare Roots talk and met some very, very encouraging people, one of them sitting beside me here today. And I think from that, I took even more of an interest in the local history, and then the genealogy followed. So today is kind of a mixture of the two. So it's a little bit on the academic side. I'll try not to use too much word salad, but it's also bringing it back to the local level. So hopefully we'll all get something from it. So as Jane said, I was here back in 2021. And that talk was more focused on the records and the people that worked in the workhouse and the people that are in the workhouse themselves. And I believe that talk is still on YouTube, so I'd recommend, if you had questions about the literal day-to-day life experiences of your ancestors, to go and check that out on YouTube if you can. Today's talk is a bit more about the top-down administrative structure of what was actually going on in the workhouse itself from the administration's level. So I'm going to take you inside the machinery of the crisis itself. And when I say the crisis itself, I'm talking 1845 until about 1849 in particular. Vice guardians and poor law inspectors, which I'll explain what they are in a minute, they only start to come into the famine experience in 1847, 1848. But the crisis is already in full flow at that stage. So just to give you an idea of where the timeline is and what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to show you how those choices that those men took shaped whether your ancestors survived or where they ended up. And actually one aspect that came up during my viva was what records they left behind for us today and how those experiences shaped what records were left. So the title of tonight's talk, as you can see behind me, is The Power and Persuasion. And those two words capture a genuine and consequential difference in how the British government managed the poor law crisis in Clare. So before I go on, can everybody in the back hear me okay? Yeah. Perfect. So just to kind of put it in perspective of where I'm coming from and what my interests are and how that shaped what I'm talking about. So as Jane said, I'm a professional genealogist and a local historian. I work for Ancestry.com. And although I'm based in Dublin, I'm a very proud Galway man. I'm from Beha in County Galway, which some of you will know borders Crusheen. And as a proud Galway man, I rarely admit this in public, but considering where I am tonight, I'm actually 3/4 Clare. I've got roots in Crusheen, Killanena and Liscasey. So as you can see from the slide, and as Jane said, I've completed my PhD very recently. But my research sits at an unusual intersection. It's both administrative history, looking at the workhouse itself, and prosopography, which is a word I never knew existed, but it's a collective study of people's lives and trying to understand what patterns can emerge from looking at a collective group of people together. Specifically the lives of the officials who were sent into the failing poor law unions during the famine to try and save them and rescue them from complete ruin. So I want to be upfront with you at the start. Some of what I'm going to share is still evolving. My focus was a comparative study on Gort in Galway and Ballyshannon in Donegal. And while I'm in the process of understanding what happened specifically in Clare, where I'm not certain I'm going to tell you during the talk. So I'm definitely not an expert in Clare experience of the Poor Law Union, but there is definitely parallels between what was happening in Ballyshannon, Donegal, and the 4 unions in particular that I'm going to talk about tonight. There will be time for questions at the end, so please hold them until then. And if we run out of time, I'm happy to speak to anyone individually afterwards. So for tonight's talk, there's 3 sections. The first is the background of the poor law system, the tools of the intervention. So I talked there a minute ago about the vice guardians and the poor law inspectors and what my research found out about those officials themselves. The second thing is I'm going to bring those findings home to Clare, talk you through each union and explain what intervention it received. And lastly, then I'm going to talk quickly about the practical research guidance. So specific records again, where to find them, and how the administrative history changes how you read them. So I'm going to start the question that drives tonight's talk, which is you may have an ancestor in the Kilrush workhouse or Ennis, Scariff or Ennis Diamond. They're in the record or they're admitted on a certain date, listed on an outdoor relief roll, perhaps buried in a workhouse cemetery, but the record tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you why things happened the way they did. So tonight's talk is about the why. Why did some unions manage to sustain relief longer than others? Why did workhouse mortality rates differ so dramatically from one area of the county to the other? And why do some unions have richer records than others? So the answer in large part lies in who was running these places, with what powers and what approach they were using while running the union. So the administrative decision shaped everything. So to give a quick overview of the background, before we get into the administrators, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the system that they were responsible for. The Irish Poor Law Act of 1838 divided Ireland into 130 poor law unions initially, each centred on a market town. That was later expanded to 163 by late 1850, but for tonight's talk, we're just going to focus on the pre-1850 unions. The workhouses were deliberately designed to be cold, intimidating, and uninviting, a place of last resort. But as poverty, starvation, and disease spread from 1846 onwards, they became overcrowded and desperate. So County Clare had 4 original poor law unions: Kilrush, Ennis Diamond, Ennis, and Scariff. After 1850, the county was reorganised, but it's those 4 originals that I'm going to examine, and they received the famine era administrative interventions I'm going to describe. There was also parts of Clare held in Limerick and Gort unions, but the focus today is just on those original 4. So the unions themselves were governed by a board of guardians. They were elected and ex officio members. They were mainly landlords, merchants, and the larger farmers. The board ran the workhouse, they collected the poor rate, and they distributed the relief in the workhouse. The whole system was overseen by the Poor Law Commission, which initially sat in London and after 1847 sat in Dublin. And that was a central body that had considerable powers of intervention. So it's those powers and how they were used in Clare that form the core of tonight's talk. So on this slide, you can see Clare Union's geography. The 4 original unions spread across the county. So on the left-hand part of the slide, you can see Kilrush in the west, Ennis along the North Atlantic coast, Ennis to the county centre, and Scariff in the east along Lough Derg. Each had a distinct geography, a distinct economic character, and as we'll see, a distinct administrative experience of the famine. The western unions, Kilrush and Ennis, faced the full severity of the Atlantic-facing crisis, extreme destitution, very high mortality, extremely high rates of evictions and clearances. Scariff, while extremely affected, had a somewhat different profile, and Ennis as the county town sat at the administrative centre. Now on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see how more unions were created after 1850, which now included the newly formed Ballyshannon on the top, Corofin just below, Kildysart on the Shannon estuary, and Tulla just there beside Scariff. So the Poor Law Commission had 2 principal tools for intervening in a struggling union. So the first was a temporary poor law inspector, which you can see here on the left. He was an official sent in to advise and persuade the existing Board of Guardians. He attended the meetings, he reported to Dublin, he pressured the Guardians to act, and he tried to win their cooperation. Critically, the board remained in place. They weren't dismissed. The inspector had no formal power to override them, and his was an instrument of persuasion. On the right then, we've got vice guardians, and their tool was power. A vice guardian was a paid official, and typically they were installed in pairs. They were appointed to replace the elected board entirely. So just to put that in perspective, typically a board was about 24 men. On average, you would have 6 or 8 people turn up to a meeting every week that would decide what they would do the following week with the money for the poor people in the workhouse. All of that board was dismissed and replaced by 2 people. And to put that again in terms of numbers, in Gort, you had a union that was roughly 110 square miles, 44,000 people within that. And those 2 men were responsible for the relief of all of those people, technically. So just to keep that in the context of what they were doing. When the vice guardians were installed, the existing guardians were dissolved by a sealed order from the Poor Law Commission in Dublin. The vice guardians, as I said, had the full authority to run the union. They struck rates, they hired and fired staff, they reorganised the relief, and they answered only to the commission in Dublin. Theirs was an instrument of power. So by 1849, there was 38 poor law unions nationally that had been dissolved for different reasons, almost a full quarter, and that was responsible for the relief of close to 2 million people. All of Clare's original unions, except Ennis, were among those. So surprisingly, there hasn't been a lot of work done on vice guardians or poor law inspectors, which was the focus of my thesis. They're the 2 models that this talk is built around. And County Clare, as I said, received both. Different unions got different interventions for different reasons. So who were these men? Because they were all men. My PhD research was the first systematic collective biography. As I said, that word that it was new to me, the prosopography, of the officials deployed under both models during the famine. Who were these men and what shaped their decisions? Well, you can see here on the left-hand side of this table, the temporary inspectors were almost uniformly former military or naval officers, men with military authority, social standing, and experience of command in difficult situations. They were predominantly Church of Ireland. Many were Irish-born, but not all, and that was linked to their occupation primarily in the military. Several died contracting typhus fever in the workhouses they were sent to reform during the famine itself. On the right then, you can see the vice guardians. They came from a more diverse background. Some with prior poor law experience as clerks in the workhouse or guardians, elected guardians elsewhere, others from legal or administrative backgrounds. They tended to be deliberate outsiders, placed in unions that had no prior connections to. The Commission chose this deliberately to avoid the web of local loyalties that had, in many cases, contributed to the union's collapse in the first place. So the Commission matched the tool to the problem, and that was one of the first findings of my research. So before I bring these findings home to Clare, I want to ask a question that sits at the heart of my research. So who were these men? So far, I've been talking about administrative models, persuasion and power, temporary inspectors and vice guardians. But these were not abstract systems. They were people. And if you're going to understand what it meant for your ancestor to have a particular official arrive in their union, you need to understand who that official was. His background, his beliefs, his experience, and in some cases, his faith. This is where prosopography comes in. So what you're looking at here is my research applied specifically to County Clare. 9 officials across 4 unions over 3 years of crisis. So I want to draw your attention to what the table shows. On the left, you have the officials' names and their unions. You'll recognize several from what I've already described. So you had Captain Kennedy in Kilrush, you had Hart and Scariff, Cronin and Ennis, Rourke and Copland and Ennis Diamond. The third column entitled Role tells you whether they served as temporary inspectors, which is what TI represents, or vice guardians, which is what VG represents, or both. And the MIL column, which stands for military background, is where something significant started to emerge. Every single temporary inspector in Clare had military or naval service. Kennedy was a former officer of the 68th Regiment. Hart had served with the 49th Regiment and would eventually reach the rank of Lieutenant General. Cronin had been a captain in the 7th Dragoon Guards. Thomas Sparks had served in the Royal Navy, reaching the rank of Commander. Now look at the Vice Guardians underneath, beginning with Andrew Rourke on the 5th row. None of them had military backgrounds. Andrew Rourke was a former elected Guardian himself, a civilian with experience of the poor law from the inside. James Joseph Fisher was a Quaker merchant from Limerick. John Christie was another Quaker from County Down. Michael Maher from Tumavara in Tipperary later became a coroner. Then look at the faith column, the last one on the right, detailing what happened to them after their poor law service. 3 of these 9 men died in the discharge of their duties. Cronin from typhus in October 1848, Rourke from fever in December 1848 after having been transferred to Loughrea, Christie from fever in April 1848 while serving in Scariff. These were not men sitting safely in Dublin offices. They were present in the workhouses among the sick and the dying. The faith column itself tells one final story. Every single temporary inspector in Clare was Church of Ireland. The vice guardians were more religiously diverse. Roman Catholic, Church of Ireland and Quakers were all represented. And that pattern holds nationally. And if you expand that to the national number, which is 112 vice guardians across all of the unions, every religious denomination at the time was represented in the vice guardian model. The inspector corps was overwhelmingly Protestant. The vice guardian appointments were more varied. The commission needed people with specific administrative experience, whatever their denomination. And then just a final note, James Copland was born in Jamaica, the only official in Clare with such an origin, though he grew up in Galway City, was later transferred to Clifton. Captain Kennedy went further than any of them. He became a colonel governor in Gambia, Sierra Leone, Western Australia, and eventually Hong Kong. Now, this is the analytical payoff of the collective biographical work. So when you look at the 9 officials as a group and ask what they have in common, a pattern emerges that is not accidental. The temporary inspectors on the left share 4 characteristics with remarkable consistency: military or naval background, Church of Ireland faith, Irish birth in most cases, and a high mortality rate from fever caught in service. The vice guardians on the right share quite a different set: no military background, religious diversity, geographical outsiders brought in from outside County Clare deliberately, and prior experience of working with the poor law from the inside. So you might ask, why does that matter? Because the temporary inspector needed social standing. He had to walk into a boardroom full of local landlords and merchants and command their respect without having any formal power over them. A former military officer, a Protestant gentleman, that was a man those boards would listen to, even if they resented him. His authority was moral and social, not legal. The vice guardian, on the other hand, needed something different. He was replacing the board entirely, so he didn't need their respect. He needed administrative competence, local detachment, and the ability to manage a complex relief operation without being captured by local interest. He needed to be an outsider, a civilian, someone who knew how the poor law worked from the inside. I argue the Commission matched the tool to the task, and my research argues this matching was deliberate policy, not chance. And that's the core finding I want you to carry into everything that follows in the slides from here. So my research examined 2 case studies in depth, as Jane alluded to at the start: Gort Union in County Galway and Ballyshannon in County Donegal. These unions received contrasting interventions and give us our clearest comparative data. Gort, on the left here, received vice guardians installed in February 1848. They replaced 24 elected guardians, and they served for over 20 months until November 1849. 5 people served in that role in total, with typically 2 present at any one time. Ballyshannon here on the right received a temporary inspector, Thomas Samuel Darcy, who arrived in October 1847 and worked with the existing board for approximately 1 year. I won't dwell long on Gort and Ballyshannon tonight because my main purpose is to bring these findings to Clare, but let me give you the key contrast because it shapes everything that follows. The vice guardians in Gort operated with authority. They did not need to explain themselves to the dissolved board. They struck rates, they collected them with military and police support, they reorganized the workhouse, and they managed enormous outdoor relief lists. Their style was uncompromising, systematic, and deliberately distant from the local elites. They were essentially emergency administrators that were parachuted in. Thomas Darcy on the right in Ballyshannon operated very differently. He had to persuade the board to act because, as I said, he had no power to compel them to act in any way. He built trust, he identified early wins, and he used public pressure and moral persuasion. By January 1848, he had turned around the previously very reluctant board. He cleared contractor debt within 3 months. He had reduced the cost per pauper from 1 shilling 10.5 pence to 1 shilling 2 pence per week. And he achieved all this without significant external funding from the Poor Law Commission, which was very much not the case in Gort. So the key finding: management approached matter as much as resources. Darcy achieved more in financial terms with the persuasion model, but Gort's destitution was far more severe. It required the blunt force of the power model to keep the people alive at all. Now, finally, you might be sick of hearing about Gort and Ballyshannon, so we're going to bring it back to County Clare. You're here tonight because you all have Clare ancestry or Clare connections or a deep history or interest in Clare history. So the question I want to answer for you is, which model did Clare unions receive, and what does that mean for your ancestors? So Clare, as I said, had 4 original poor law unions in this period: Kilrush, Ennis, Ennis and Scariff. As I mentioned, after 1850, the county was reorganised with additional unions, but it's just those 4 we'll focus on tonight. Each received a distinct response from the Commission, and each had a distinct administrative story. So first up then is Ennis. Owen Lloyd was appointed as temporary poor law inspector in February 1848, and it was Lloyd who oversaw the dissolution of the board. Vice guardians were installed on the 25th of February, within days of Lloyd's arrival. The local reaction was extraordinary. The newspaper reported that when news reached the town of Ennis the paid guardians were coming, it was decided, quote, that the town should be illuminated and bonfires lighted, end quote. The dismissal of the board then can be seen as genuinely popular, And here's a detail that tells us something important. When Lloyd visited the workhouse ahead of the dissolution, he found it in, quote, the most orderly and correct condition, end quote, a model of cleanliness and care. Yet the dissolution still proceeded. The workhouse was not the problem. The board governing it was the problem, so the commission dissolved it anyway. The vice guardians appointed in Ennis Diamond were Andrew Rourke and James Copland. Rourke was a Catholic nationalist from County Meath, a former elected guardian in Ballyshannon Union with connections to the repeal movement and to Daniel O'Connell himself. James Copland was a former timber merchant from Galway City. They were deliberate outsiders, as was the pattern. For genealogists and historians, this context is important. If your ancestor was in the Ennis Diamond workhouse from 1848, they were managed by an overhauled system. Kilrush Union then. Kilrush is the union most associated in historical memory with Famine Clare, largely because of the documented clearances and the work of Captain Arthur Kennedy. Kennedy arrived in Kilrush in November 1847 as a temporary poor law inspector. He was a military man, a former officer of the 68th Regiment, Church of Ireland, and he was born in County Down. He came back to Ireland in 1846 from his military services and was appointed to the Poor Law Service. Kilrush became the posting that defined his life and in many ways his career. It has been written that Kennedy loaded the landlords of West Clare and made powerful enemies. He documented in meticulous detail the evictions, the clearances, and the cabins tumbled on the dying. His reports to Dublin are among the most powerful primary sources of the entire famine period, available today on Google Books and through the Clare Library website. So here's the critical genealogical point about Kilrush. Kennedy's 138 days as a temporary inspector before the vice guardians arrived in March 1848 is what makes this union so extraordinarily well documented. During that period, he worked with the existing board of guardians, nudging, pressuring, reporting. When you see decisions in the Kilrush books from late 1847 into early 1848, those are board decisions, but Kennedy's influence is behind many of them. And then from 11th of March 1848, vice guardians replaced the board, and you're looking at a very different kind of record. Kennedy himself went on to become a colonial governor in Gambia, Sierra Leone, Western Australia, and Hong Kong, and had one of the most remarkable careers produced by any of the famine era. Kennedy's reports to the Poor Law Commission are, as I said, exceptional genealogical sources that are not as widely used as they should be, in my opinion. He documented specific townlands, named landlords, described the conditions of the people, and his reports from 1848 and 1849 to the Poor Law Commission name some individuals. They describe clearances in specific electoral divisions. He gives numbers, how many cabins were tumbled, how many people were expelled, and how many died. By cross-referencing those reports with other documents like Griffith's valuation, so for example, if a townland appears in Kennedy's clearance documents, Griffiths will show you who was no longer there by 1855. If your ancestor disappears from the record in the late 1840s and had been present in the tides and later land valuation records and are now simply gone, Kennedy's reports may tell you exactly why. Next then is Ennis. So Ennis is the most intriguing of Clare's unions administratively because it represents what I think of as the implicit persuasion model, where the threat of intervention was the tool itself. Ennis was not dissolved. John Cronin was appointed as a temporary poor law inspector on the 2nd of February 1848. The board was threatened with dissolution, and the chairman actually used that threat explicitly, invoking the prospect of vice guardians arriving to drive up attendance at board meetings. It worked. The board was never dissolved, and Ennis retained its locally elected guardians throughout the main crisis period. Cronin himself paid the ultimate price. He died of typhus contracted in the discharge of his duties in November 1848 at the age of 42. So for genealogists, again, the learning here is if your ancestor is in the Ennis workhouse, They were entering a system still governed by locally elected men, with all the strengths and weaknesses that that implied. The decisions about who got relief, how relief was allocated, and how that workhouse was managed were made by men who were themselves part of that community. That can cut both ways. Local knowledge could mean more responsive relief, or it could mean the perpetuation of local power structures in the workhouse. And lastly, then, we have Scariff. Scariff in the east of the county presents another striking administrative story. So, a temporary inspector, Major Henry George Hart of the 49th Regiment, was appointed on the 27th of October, 1847. Vice guardians were installed 24 hours later. One day. The commission had clearly made its decision before Hart even arrived. That 24-hour gap between temporary inspector and vice guardians is quite unique nationally, and a damning indictment of the commission's opinion of the board in Scariff. In fact, it's the only one where the gap is that small. The vice guardians included James Joseph Fisher, Quaker from Limerick, John Christie, another Quaker from County Down, and Christie died of fever in April while serving there. Hart himself, as I said earlier, became a lieutenant general. So I see a few people taking photographs. If you want to take a photograph, this is probably the one to photograph. It kind of brings it all together on one slide of what I've just been saying, because it pulls everything together in a single picture. What you're looking at is not a commission applying a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a poor law commission making deliberate, differentiated choices about how to manage 4 very different situations. So to recap, we had Kilrush, which was the Persuasion model with the temporary inspector initially. Kennedy's 138-day period produced extraordinary documentation, and then in March 1848 you had the arrival of the vice guardians. The output of that was the richest genealogical record of any union in Clare, and perhaps even in Ireland. Next up then you had Ennis Diamond, which had staged intervention as well. You had Lloyd as the temporary inspector, then Rourke and Copland as vice guardians installed within days, with systematic relief management from February 1848 onwards. Ennis, I would call this implicit persuasion. Cronin as the inspector, the board retained, although under threat, locally elected governance throughout the crisis with all the strengths and weaknesses that entailed. Lastly, but not least, Scariff was again immediate power. Hart as the temporary inspector for one single day, then the vice guardians arrive. The quickest dissolution in Clare's famine history. So collectively, they weren't accidents and they were policy. The commission was not applying a one-size-fits-all. It was matching the intervention to the conditions on the ground. And those different interventions produced different records, different outcomes, and different experiences for your ancestors. So I'm going to try and translate all of this into practical guidance now for your family and local history research. And I'm going to attempt to give a framework for thinking about what you'll find in the records and why. So the first one here, the first principle is to know your union. Not just which county, because remember some union boundaries do cross county boundaries, like Gort, parts of Scariff as well, Limerick. But you need to know the parish, not just the parish, you need to know which union and what happened to that union's administration between 1847 and 1850. Because as I've shown, that context changes how you should read the record. Principle 2 then, that records reflect the administration. A union with systematic vice guardian management will have more systematic records. If board minutes or relief registers don't survive, which they don't for a lot of the poor law unions in Clare, be sure to examine parliamentary papers, as vice guardians and temporary inspectors were in more constant communication with the Poor Law Commission in Dublin than the board that they had just replaced. A union with a struggling or dysfunctional board may have gaps, errors, or an absence of certain types of records. Principle 3 then is the administrative decisions created the conditions for post-famine clearances. What happened to your ancestors' family after the famine, whether they stayed, they emigrated, or disappeared, was often set in motion by decisions made in the workhouse boardroom between 1847 and 1850. and who made those decisions mattered. In terms of records that survive, the most important is the Board of Guardian minute books. For Kilrush and Ennis Diamond, they are digitised to find my past. Kilrush runs from 1839 to 1852 with some gaps, and Ennis Diamond has similar coverage. They record every decision made week by week, and names appear there when there were complaints, sometimes deaths, or sometimes transfers to other unions. They're very administrative records. They're meetings of minutes, so it's not common to find details about individuals unless there's a reason for them to be brought up. The next type of record we have then is the workhouse admission and discharge registers. They record who entered and left. Unfortunately for Clare, I'm not aware of any such records surviving, but I'm open to correction about that from anybody here. I'd love if I was wrong about that. They'd be great to examine. And lastly then would be the death registers of the parliamentary returns of deaths. Particularly for Kilrush and Ennis Diamond, they're exceptional. The 1851 return covers the period from March 1850 to March 1851 and gives cause of death, age, gender, and dates. And according to famine scholar Andreas Eriksson, they cover approximately 85% of all deaths in those workhouse buildings during those periods. The next type of records, which is one of my favorites, is the Famine Relief Commission papers. They're one of the great underutilized genealogical resources for this period. There's roughly 80,000 records. They're available on Ancestry.com and elsewhere. But of that collection, the series RLFC3, the incoming letters to the Commission, is the most useful. It contains letters from local relief committees, landlords, clergy, guardians, and ordinary people. They describe conditions in specific places, they name individuals, they list subscription amounts, and they detail the activities of the relief committees themselves. So for Clare, the baronial sub-series allows you to drill down to your ancestor's barony, so as well as your poor law union, you need to know what barony is relevant. Letters name people receiving relief, they describe the state of particular townlands, and sometimes give extraordinary detail about individual families. So I had to trawl through some of my notes, for example, in preparation for this talk. And one of the letters I've transcribed talks about George Wyndham, a landlord in, I'm going to say West Clare, talking about how he doesn't want to give money to the relief committee because he's already given enough to send his tenants with assistant immigration to America. And that kind of detail is what you find in the records. That's not kept anywhere else. If your ancestor was a member of a relief committee, a subscriber to a fund, a clergyman who wrote to the commission, or simply a named individual in distress, they may appear in those papers. I also want to draw your attention to newspapers as a genealogical source for this period that is genuinely underutilized. So we have the Freeman's Journal and the Dublin Weekly Nation. I talked about this in 2021. They carried the death census, which were essentially weekly reports from the Catholic clergy of different parishes giving death totals by Catholic parish. 4 reports, I believe, survive for Kilrush, and there is comparable coverage for other parishes, but they will be kept in the Freeman's Journal or the Dublin Weekly Nation. Then you have the Limerick Chronicle and the Limerick and Clare Examiner. They reported extensively on board meetings, workhouse conditions, deaths and evictions, and sometimes they name individuals they covered Kilrush and Ennis Diamond in depth. On the bottom left here, we have, I mentioned British Newspaper Archive, which is a subscription website where a lot of these newspapers are accessible. And I find that it's essential for detailed Clare coverage, particularly during the famine. For example, they have the Clare Journal and the Ennis Advertiser. On the bottom right then, we have the Chronicling America, which is a Library of Congress in the US website. It's free. It's particularly useful for Irish American newspapers that carried news from home or arrival notices that can connect your Clare ancestor potentially to a specific parish or townland, So, for example, you might find the missing friends notices are quite often kept in the Irish American newspapers as well. And lastly, of course, Kennedy's reports, which I mentioned, they're on Google Books. So if you just Google Kennedy, Kilrush, Poor Law, it'll be one of the first ones you'll come across. Archive.org has copies of those reports, and key sections are transcribed in the Clare Library website as well. So I want to spend a few minutes on something that connects directly to the administrative history I've just described and the post-famine clearances in Clare, specifically in West Clare. Kennedy's reports document what is acknowledged as one of the most extensive eviction campaigns in Irish famine history. Between 1848 and 1850, thousands of families were expelled from their holdings in Kilrush Union, not just evicted, but subjected to what Kennedy called tumbling, the demolition of their cabins to prevent return. The connection to administration is direct. The failure of the elected board in earlier years to manage relief effectively had created a financial crisis in the union. That financial crisis put pressure on landlords to clear their estates to reduce the rate burden. The clearances were in part then a consequence of administrative failure. So for genealogists, if your West Clare ancestor disappears from the record between those dates, that's the context behind that. They may have died, they may have entered the workhouse, or they may have been part of the clearances, expelled, their cabin demolished, dispersed toward the immigrant ships. Kennedy's reports might name them. Griffin's primary valuation, with most of Clare surveyed around 1855, is usually used as a static snapshot of who's on the land at a given date. But used against the 1841 and 1851 census figures and the Tithe Plotman books, which were typically in the late 1820s, it becomes a powerful tool for mapping the famine impact. By using a triangulation method, so for example, if you took a townland in the Kilrush electoral division, find every name in the tithes, then examine the total number of inhabitants listed in the 1841 and 1851 census totals, then check Griffiths from 4 years later. The names that have disappeared represent families that either died, immigrated, or were cleared. The names that remain, sometimes with reduced landholdings, are the survivors. Crucially, the administrative history changes how you interpret those absences. In Kilrush, where the clearances were documented and systematic, an absence from Griffiths is more likely to represent violent displacement than natural death or simple emigration. If Kennedy documented clearances in that townland and the name is absent from Griffiths, that is a probable clearance. That matters for how you search for what happened next to those families and opens new lines of research, including ship records, immigrant passenger lists, landlord estate papers, landed estate court rentals, etc. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to flag one more important resource, and they are the Irish Reproductive Loan Fund records, or sometimes called the Poverty Relief Loans, and they're accessible on Ancestry, Find My Past, and Family Search. So there's over 5,300 entries for County Clare alone, and they cover the period between 1824 and 1846, and that means they predate the famine and capture families hit before the crisis. They record borrowers and their guarantors, typically close family members or neighbours, occupation, parish, townland, and crucially, follow-up notes, whether the borrower was still resident, had immigrated, or had died. And again, for a family historian, finding your Clare ancestors here means you get their name, occupation, townland, and at least 2 other names closely connected to them. In an area where pre-famine records can be sparse, that is genuinely significant. So now, as we're very close to the end of the talk, I'll give you a step-by-step framework for researching a Clare famine ancestor. So the first step, as I said, to identify the union, and you can use the IR Atlas website or John Grenham's Townlands in Ireland website as a quick way to figure that out. Know whether you're in Kilrush, Ennis, Ennis, or Scariff. The second step then is to understand the administrative context using tonight's talk as your starting point. What model did your union receive? What does that mean for the records and the outcomes? Step 3, start with the Board of Guardians minute books. If your union is Kilrush or Ennis Diamond, access those through Find My Past, search by name where possible, but also by electoral division or townland. Fourth step then is to layer in the Famine Relief Commission papers on ancestry by searching the baronial subseries for your ancestor's barony. Fifth step, check Kennedy's reports if you're in Kilrush. They may directly document your ancestor's townland. Cross-reference that then with Griffith's valuation to identify who survived and who didn't, mapping those absences against the tithes, the loan funds, and the 1841 and 1851 census returns to try identify who survived and who didn't. And lastly, then check newspapers, mostly accessible on British Newspaper Archive. You can also check out Irish newspaper archives, chronicling America, particularly for American connections, and the digitized Famine era press and the National Library's digital collections as well on their website online. So I want to be honest about the limits of the records because I think that honesty actually helps your research. The records document the people who interacted with the official relief system. They are not a complete record of the famine experience. They document those who entered the workhouse, who received outdoor relief, or who appeared before the board, but they are not a complete record of the famine experience. Many people who died during the famine never entered a workhouse. Many who survived did so through informal community support, through charity, through their own resources, and they leave little official trace. The people absent from workhouse records are not necessarily absent from history. They may simply have survived through channels that left no official footprint. This is why the clergy death reports, the newspaper accounts, the estate papers, and the reproductive loan fund records matter. They capture parts of the experience that official records miss. Your research, to be complete, needs to triangulate across all of those sources. So I've spent a lot of time tonight on administrative structures and record types, and I want to end the talk by coming back to the humans at the center of the story that I started with, the men who were the focus of my research. So I'm going to call out the three here on the screen in front of me. John Cronin, appointed to Ennis, contracted typhus in the discharge of his duties and died in November 1848. Now, he died at the home of a family member in Dublin City, far from the Union where he'd worked himself to death. Andrew Rourke died of fever in December 1848 after being transferred to Loughrea. He was the son of a promised nationalist family, a man who had sat beside Daniel O'Connell at several repeal dinners in 1843. He also died serving the system. Thomas Darcy then, the inspector in Ballyshannon, contracted fever in Nina workhouse, and he died there in 1849, less than 6 months after leaving Ballyshannon. These men were not distant bureaucrats. They were present, they were engaged, often deeply affected by what they witnessed. So, for example, Kennedy's letters describe a man in anguish at what he was seeing every day in Kilrush. The administrative story is ultimately a human story. And the ancestors you're researching, the woman in the Kilrush workhouse minute books, the man named in Kennedy's report, the family gone from Griffiths who were there in Tide books, they were human beings whose fate was shaped by the decisions of others in a crisis that could have been managed better and in some places was. So let me draw together the threads of tonight's talk. Administrative choices during the famine were not uniform. The Poor Law Commission had deliberate strategies, matching intervention types to local conditions. In Clare, different unions received different models of oversight, and those differences shaped everything. The records that survived, the relief that was delivered, and the clearances that followed. For genealogists, this means context matters. The record you're looking at was created by a specific administrative system with specific capabilities and specific limitations. Understanding who was running a union with what powers and what approach helps you read the record, identify the gaps, and understand what your ancestors' experience actually was. My research is the first systematic attempt to understand who these officials were as a group, their backgrounds, their beliefs, and their faith. The finding that the Commission matched official types to intervention models is, I believe, a new contribution to our understanding of how the British government responded to the famine. And tonight I've tried to bring that contribution home to Clare. So to finish, let me say that I'm very grateful for your attention. It's research that I care deeply about because it's about real people, and because I believe that understanding the history behind the famine, it helps understand what our ancestors actually went through. So I'm very happy to take questions, and if you have a Clare ancestor whose story is puzzling, let's see if we can make sense of it together. Thanks very much.
Can I just remind you, we're recording the talk and the questions, so please wait until Jane brings you the microphone so your question will be picked up on the recording.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was excellent. There's a lot to take in there and a lot to think about. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Eamon?
Don't be shy.
Yeah. Well, we have him here now. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm not going to be able to walk over. Sorry. Can you? Yeah, a bit off. Thank you.
Sorry, when you're talking about unions, are you talking about the union workhouse, or is it a broader concept than that?
The entire union itself. So the
Right.
workhouse is at the center of the union,
Yes,
but the union could be anywhere between 110 miles squared and 200 miles squared.
right. And with these men, these people who are running the union, would they be based in the workhouse?
Yes,
They would, and would they live in there
yes,
All of them?
with their families.
with their families?
Yeah.
So they were all very vulnerable, actually. Yeah.
Extremely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. That's a good point, actually. Yeah.
So I delivered a similar talk 2 years ago in Portumna, and there was a man in the audience who was very adamant that these men were doing it for the money. And he may have had a point. The salary was quite substantial. It was £250 at the time. But I don't know of the balance there between the money and living in the workhouse. Again, to put those in perspective, Gort workhouse was built for 500, and I talked to Gort because I know it the best. It was built for 500 people, but at the height of the famine, there were 6,000 living in there. And he was living in there with his family. So I don't know. I don't know if £250 would be enough for me to live in that. Yeah.
Kennedy did not live in the workhouse.
No.
He lived in Kappa House.
You live in
Kilrush.
Kappa? Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Anyone? Yeah.
When you say the Poor Law Union was established in 1830,
38, yeah.
what did it do between that and the famine?
Well, it provided very basic relief. So we were talking people, older people or very young people, orphans in particular, that had nowhere else to go. We'll say wandering beggars, because it was illegal to be wandering on the road. Quite often the conditions there were generally worse than what the general poorest person would have had intentionally, because they didn't want to be overrun, essentially. And it did its job. It did what it was designed to do, as morally reprehensible as we see that now. It wasn't until the famine hit that it became overrun and the system started to creak. And a large part of the reason that happened was the poorer areas were taxed the most. So if you had a townland that had 100 people and 80 of them were in the workhouse, the rates for that area were higher, which bankrupted the landlord responsible for that quicker. So it was in the landlord's interest then to not have any poor people on his land, because his tax would be lower, if that makes sense. So the system itself wasn't built to deal with massive poverty like that, especially during the time of a crisis.
So the workhouses were actually financed by the landlords, were they?
They were financed by the land within the Poor Law Union.
Okay.
So everybody would have to have paid something unless your land was valued at £4 or less. The landlord was the one responsible.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Anyone want to ask any? Any other questions? Any other comments? Yeah, Eric.
Just a question on Clare Castle. We had 2 auxiliary workhouses for women and girls. and there were, I think, up to 600 population there at one stage. We have no tradition at all in Clarecastle of a famine grave. We've no idea where people that died obviously would have died in these workhouses, where they might have been buried. There's a local graveyard, Clare Hill. There's all sorts of traditions there. There's a collar grave, there's other graves, but there's no mention anywhere of a famine grave. We're fascinated to know what happened.
So the first question I would have there is there anything, do minute books survive for that part at all?
I don't think so. And you see, Clarecastle was known, the old name for Clarecastle is simply the village of Clare.
Clare, okay.
So when you're trying to look up Clare records, you get the county, you get a town in Suffolk or somewhere. But
so I suppose the
it's
way
hard
I
to
would
pin it down.
the way I would approach that is Eric. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric. The way I would approach that. So quite often, and I've had similar problems myself, right? Searching through the keyword searching, right? If you know the name of the clerk for the part of the union and you keyword search that through the parliamentary paper reports, right? So there was a Poor Law Commission, there was a report sent every year.
Okay.
And if you search the clerk's name through that as opposed to Clare, because I would imagine there's a lot more Clares than there would be his name, we'll say. What you might find is there's a discussion about procuring a burial ground.
Yeah.
Now, it might sound a bit far-fetched, but actually the same thing happened in Gort and Ballyshannon. In fact, it was one of the reasons why the Gort board were dismissed, is they refused to procure a dedicated burial ground. They were burying the bodies on the workhouse site itself. Now, when the deaths got too high, it became very unsanitary to do that, which is why they were dismissed. But there's no mention of that, would say, in any other types of records. In the minute books is very minimal, but in the parliamentary returns, there's a massive discussion about that between the clerk, the Poor Law inspector that's coming inspecting to see if they're done what they're told to do by the Poor Law Commission. So I don't know if that doesn't make sense. Come up to me afterwards and we can talk through it.
Okay, thank you.
But that's what I would do, to have a look and see.
That's great. That's great, Eamon. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah, Betty, do you? Yeah.
I have a question. For example, a woman that I was researching said that she died in Ennis workhouse, but it didn't say where she came from. So how do I know that that's the one I'm looking for?
That's the problem. Unless those registers survive, which I'm pretty sure they don't, depending on the time period, of course, it's next to impossible to know, unfortunately.
Anyone else? Everyone else? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Eamon. That's very informative now. Lots of different ways of looking at some of the records and gathering the information. Well done, thank you. And I hope you all enjoyed that as well. Our next meeting is I think it's the 19th of March here. And we will have one of our own members speaking that night, Aileen Wynn, on her master's, the research she did for her master's degree. So hopefully we'll see you all there again. Thank you very much for attending. And thanks again, Eamon, a terrific talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.